Primarily, I'm an architectural historian, and I want to tell you just very briefly how the book that I've written here came about. And that is, I've written a couple of books about Frank Lloyd Wright in the past. I've written a couple of books about Thomas Jefferson in the past. And as I was thinking about what I would do next, I was thinking about the full range of American architecture. And if you get away from the United States, and you ask Europeans, you ask worldly people, who were the three American architects that influenced world architecture? There's Mr. Jefferson, there's Mr. Wright, and Henry Hobson Richardson is the third. And he's relatively unknown in this country, as Phil alluded to earlier. And I said this to my editor at The Atlantic. I'd like to do a book about him because it's really unfair. I'd like to try and put him back on, in the conversation. And a very wise man is George. And George said to me, well, that's fine. I actually know a little bit about Richardson because I went to college in Boston. Of course, there's lots of stuff in Boston that was designed by Richardson. But Hugh, my question is, who the hell is going to buy your book if they don't know who this guy is? Which was a very wise question, and we came up with an answer to that. And that came about because I did a bit more research and spent enough time to realize that Henry Hobson Richardson and this guy, Frederick Law Olmsted, were bosom buddies. Might be a little strong, but they were very good friends, and they influenced one another very significantly. In fact, there's a quote here that I'll come to in a minute that will, I think, make the case a little bit better. But I'm going to give you a little bit of larger context, and that is when Frederick Law Olmsted was born in 1822, the world was very different. And in the course of his lifetime, he died in 1903, the American landscape was radically changed. When he was born, the tallest thing that you could see, and the tallest structures that you would see anywhere were ship masts and church steeples. That simply was not true by the turn of the 20th century. The population grew 8-fold in his lifetime, so you can imagine that little towns became bigger ones and little cities became vastly bigger ones. In fact, when he was born, no one lived more than a mile or two from pretty much wild countryside. Maybe it was farmed a little bit, maybe it was forest, maybe it was just completely wild, but nature was near. By the time he died, that simply wasn't true. Cities were much larger. There were suburbs where there hadn't been suburbs before. So the world was really transformed in his lifetime. Now, Frederick Law Olmsted didn't cause any of this, but to put it bluntly, he had an immense role in preventing development from swallowing up the natural world. His life's work was, in short, and this is a quote from him, about conserving the profuse, careless utterance of nature. He was a man of parts. He was disposed first and foremost to appreciate the scenic, but before he got into the business of designing parks, he had quite a varied career. Born in Connecticut, Connecticut Yankee. His father's family, the first of the Olmsteds, arrived in the 1630s. His father was a very successful dry goods merchant in Hartford and, in fact, underwrote a good many of Olmsted's early projects. Frederick Law Olmsted, was on his way theoretically to Yale, or at least to take the entrance exams to get into Yale, and he should have known better. He did a header into a stand of poisoned sumac. Got an unimaginably terrible case of blisters around his eyes. It didn't go away. It only got worse. He sought a consult, he and his father, the consult of a physician in New York, who said, this is really not the time for you to be doing a lot of studying and reading in order to take those exams to get into Yale. So that was the end of his college experience. He never went. He did actually, when his younger brother was there, he audited courses for one semester, but he's not a college guy. So at 16, with that expectation of going to college and doing wherever, letting that take him wherever it would have led, his father got him a job as a surveyor. He spent about 18 months traveling around New England, but meets and bounds and chains didn't interest the young man. So he tried something else. He became a clerk in a shop, in a dry goods shop in downtown Manhattan, commuting back and forth from Brooklyn. He did that for a year. That really didn't take. Next, he spent a year on a China trader going all the way to the Orient and back. That was the worst yet because he almost died. He came back so jaundiced and so underweight that his father didn't recognize him on the wharf when he got off the ship. And then he tried farming. That worked a little bit better. He had a farm on the south coast of Connecticut, which wasn't big enough for it to actually make money, so his father bought him a larger farm on Staten Island. He liked that. That worked well. He started planting trees. He was always a tree man at some basic, kind of fundamental level. He was always a tree man, always interested in those in particular. And then he became a travel writer. He had the kind of urge for going. He worked for a new newspaper called the New York Daily Times, doing reports from the South. Travel around the South, portrayed what he saw in reportorial efforts about life in the South in the 1850s. And his characterization of slavery was such that his books became kind of foundational reading for people who were very concerned about abolition. And then, quite by accident, he was editing a set of his columns to be turned into a new book when he met a man in the lobby of an inn in Connecticut, somebody he knew, who told him that there was a job open in New York to become superintendent of the new park that was being created in New York. This was in 1857, summer of 1857, and at that point, there were no city parks in the country. None. There were some large cemeteries, there were some little squares, some city squares, but there was no naturalized park in any city in the country. So he applied for the job, got it, and built that first park. And in the process, developed a philosophy that informed the rest of his working life. That essentially health, strength, and morality, his words, as well as a fundamental sense of democracy, is to be derived from parks, and they are supposed to serve all classes. So this he wasn't building parks for fancy people. He was building parks for all kinds of people because he thought that it made society better. He obviously did that and more. So this is the Olmsted who was not just a park maker, but also an urbanist. The bulk of the park was written was finished before the Civil War. He did not enjoy the bureaucracy of New York City, so he, at some point at the very beginning of the Civil War, wanted to do something for the nation. Took a job as chair of the Sanitary Commission, which was essentially the medical corps for the Army. The Army really didn't have a medical corps, so there was this philanthropy created to accomplish that. And he did that for a couple of years. And, I've missed a couple of slides here. Let me just bring you up to date. This is he during the Central Park days, looking rather dapper, I would say. This was the original plan that he devised along with his partner Calvert Vaux for Central Park. And aside from the presence of a bunch of ball fields in the Sheep's Meadow, it really looks quite a lot like that today, which is in its way kind of astonishing. Again, this is the bird's eye view in 1860. But in 1863, he took a job working at something called Mariposa Mines in Mariposa, California. And that actually didn't go very well. He didn't make a lot of money. It wasn't very satisfactory, but it did expose him to what we know as the National Park at Yosemite, which at that point was essentially unknown to anybody but Native Americans. Only a few hundred Europeans had ever seen it. And he, long story short, spearheaded an effort to conserve that wonderful valley, writing a document, educating a fair number of powerful politicians. And that effort, in some sense, led to the establishment of the National Park Service some years later. He himself was very involved with the conservation of Niagara Falls and the turning of that into a state preservation site. And in a very real sense, he sort of did the first kind of philosophical thinking about what we regard today as environmentalism. He would not have recognized that term. It wouldn't have meant anything to him. Which brings me very quickly to Henry Hobson Richardson for a minute. I'm going to do you a very quick sort of wander. He came back, Olmsted, came back in 1865 and almost immediately got involved with what was actually his favorite park, Prospect Park in Brooklyn. But he also, living on Staten Island as he was at the time, he met this man who had also just come to New York from having his training at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. This is Henry Hobson Richardson. And as Olmsted said of him, I cannot express or make those who did not know him even dimly understand how much Richardson was in one's life, how much help and comfort he gave one in its work. He was the greatest comfort and the most potent stimulus that has ever come into my artistic life. I'm going to give you a sort of very quick visit of a few things that they did together. This was the original Fenway Park. Not a baseball field, obviously, but a park, better known as the Fens. The bridge is Richardson, the surrounding park is Olmsted. They did things together which were wildly influential in the architectural world. This is the Richardson building, but it's an Olmsted landscape. And as you can see, Olmsted figured out a way to use this, rough, rugged, ready outcropping of stone so that Richardson could put a house on it that looks rather like it grew out of it somehow. I think it's a very effective building. He also worked on lots of private landscapes, including this one, building this gate lodge, which for anyone who's taken an American survey course in architecture, this is in every one of those volumes. It's a spectacular little building. And again, Richardson was aided by Olmsted as they figured out a way to sort of plant the building and the landscape. Now, this could just as easily have been in western Massachusetts, here in the Berkshires, as could have this mansion, which happens to be in Waltham, but again, it could be here. They also did a lot of train stations. In fact, it's worth given that Phil was talking about train stations before, to elaborate a little bit. There were no, as I mentioned before, there were no suburbs, before the Civil War. Suburbs really began. They were sort of post-railroad occurrence. You had to have the railroads before you can have the suburbs. And one of the rail companies in Boston, the Boston Albany Rail Station, was operated by somebody by the name of Sargent, who also designed he also was the creator of the Arnold Arboretum, which Olmsted also designed, by the way. And the Boston Albany Railroad wanted to build business. They wanted to sell tickets. And so they said, if people are going to go to the suburbs, they should feel welcome in these suburbs. We should create buildings that are welcoming and warm, convenient, with coverings so that if it's a rainy day, you don't have to get wet and so forth. So the stations that Richardson built that were set into the landscape by Olmsted were several dozen Richardson buildings, hundreds probably of buildings that were inspired by them across the country, including the one here. Much more to be said there, but I will move on and say this was an Olmsted project. It doesn't have January 6th rioters hanging off the balustrades, but it's recognizably the same space, and that was very much Olmsted's doing. He moved to Boston, in part to be near Richardson. They lived within about a 2 minutes walk of one another in Brookline. And Olmsted, in the end of his life, had three really major projects that are recognizable to many: the Chicago Exposition in 1893, the Columbia Exposition, Biltmore, that fantastic Vanderbilt house down in Asheville, and also the campus for the Leland Stanford Junior University in Palo Alto, California. That's also an Olmsted job. In 1895, he retired from his practice. His brain was failing, but his son and stepson carried on rather gloriously, rather memorably, as Anini will be talking about some of his sons and stepsons' work. His thinking was also extraordinarily contemporary, and I mean contemporary to our time. I know he would nod impatiently if he read the recent articles about how impoverished neighborhoods in urban areas that have no trees are hotter and less healthy. That's a notion that Olmsted propagated 150 years ago. I mean, that's why he wanted to build parks, in part. And let's not forget that he was also one of those people. He was a little bit of an artist. He was a wonderful manager. He was a very good writer. He had all these skills that he brought, including hydrologist. So that, for example, when he built the original Fenway Park, the Fens, as it were, he engineered that such that when Hurricane Ida hit Boston in 2021, I think, the skyscrapers downtown all got flooded. They had water in their lobbies up to your knees. His park, which was built 150 years before that, absorbed all that flood, and it was as if it had never happened. Anyway, so Olmsted was, in my estimation, this was one of the sort of great realizations of working on this, he really had one of the great minds of the 19th century, not least because I think he could see the future. And I'm going to turn this over to Nini.
Bill, can you come and watch this? I thought you were sick. You know. Go sit over there. Is the mic on? It's on. It's on. Yeah. Philip and Hillary, after all this planning, it's happened, and we're here, and this is my chance to thank you both for forcing a subject onto me, which I tried to duck out of a little bit, and I thought, oh gosh, I mean, reading Hugh's book really encouraged me into the subject, and I really recommend Richardson and Olmsted from that perspective. But here I'm being asked to tell about what did Olmsted do right here in the Berkshires, and I'm getting all literal. I mean, the man whose birthday we are celebrating, the 200th birthday of Frederick Law Olmsted, of whom Hugh has spoken about so much, not the entire firm and the long life of that landscape firm. So when you asked me to do this, in the course of my research, all I had been finding were cases where Olmsted didn't get the job, or didn't show up, or didn't follow up. So the first one is the one for Philip. In 1881, I had this letter where Lucius Tuckerman writes, Frederick Law Olmsted, still working in New York before he moved to Boston. Would you by any chance be taking private clients? My wife says you are. And would, for $25 a day and a nice room in our house, would you come and consult with us about Ingleside, where Philip's uncle Jim, Dealey, and Pat and Pam and Kathy lived for so many years. Anyway, didn't show up. He didn't come. The other one that's so well known is Normkeg. He came to Normkeg, did an initial consult, said you got to take down that white oak, and the Choates didn't want to do that, and they got another landscape architect, Nathan Barrett. But they did hire the Olmsted firm to design their cemetery plot in the Stockbridge cemetery. And then one more failure of Olmsted to show up was Morris Jessup on Cliffwood Street in Lenox, if you can visualize all that. He's built these 3 platforms on the hillside of where to put Belvoir Terrace, and he wants an answer from Olmsted, and Olmsted's not coming, not showing up. This is a busy man who's juggling a million other projects, and the Lennox client ends up going to Ernest Bowditch, a different landscape architect who gets the job done. So I thought this was going to be a really short talk about Olmsted and the Berkshires. But meanwhile, I've got you five Olmsted landscapes to consider. And the first I want to make sure is really so obvious and so impressive that any time now after this talk that you are driving on the old Stockbridge Road, you must recognize that Elm Court, with half a mile of that low stone wall, is an Olmsted-designed landscape. Now, what the firm would do is they'd take a local surveyor would have done contour maps for the firm. They would cut out the plan of the house as the architects had proposed, and they would work with all the problems of siting, drainage, driveways, views, so where the sun was rising and falling. And Elm Court was situated where it is because of Olmsted's direction. And I have a feeling that he probably did come. And Dodidi Petri wondered whether he would have, but this was the absolute tip of the iceberg in 1885 for all the Vanderbilt jobs that Olmsted would get. So Emily Vanderbilt Sloan and William D. Sloan built Elm Court. They were starting it in 1885, and it was a relatively small house. Whoops. That's the size what they were starting with, and then about 6 months underway, Emily's father died very unexpectedly, and all those siblings inherited incredible wads of money, and there was houses that were being designed in Newport, Breakers and Marble House, up in Lake Champlain, Shelburne Farms, on the Hudson, Hyde Park, and of course Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, where every sibling hired Olmsted, having picked up from their sister Emily how much she appreciated his contribution to Elm Court. So Elm Court, major important job. Now, she had, I think, 7 siblings, or 6, counting her, and William Sloan, her husband, had a brother, John, who was building a house here in Lennox, and the Cranwell is another Olmsted-designed landscape. This is a Miraval now, and it's a little complicated because at the very point that this was being designed, if you could see the fine print, it's Olmsted and Eliot. So Charles Eliot, founder of the Trustees of Reservations, is said to have really been responsible for this job. But you see it all the time, at least I do, because I'm driving from Tyringham to Lennox to Pittsfield, and so you think Olmsted when you drive past, okay? Now, just to explain a little more about the Elm Court significance, Mrs. Sloan, as later in life, called back the Olmsted firm to do another garden. By this time, her first husband's died. She's married to a high-profile diplomat, Henry White, and the house has grown to 90 rooms, and it needs a new garden. So the garden at Elm Court is with a loggia and terraced spaces is the work of the Olmsted firm, really a brilliant guy, Frederick Dawson, in 1924. So the Sloanes had a long-term connection to Olmsted. So did the Wheatley, the owners of Wheatley. Okay, you ready all to go to the third place is Wheatley. And Wheatley here, looking out the loggia, the beautiful lawn where Isabella Duncan said to have danced. Here, this property, before Mr. Cook bought the land, he wrote Frederick Law Olmsted saying, "I'm thinking of it, could you come and take a look?" And it's a few acres, was 200 acres. So now, today, it's a little confusing. You can go to the hotel itself, Wheatley, which is on the land. But just to give you a sense of these many acres, here's where the hotel is. All the White Pines condominiums are where the farm buildings are here with a separate driveway. Hotel uses this driveway. The land went all over the place. Here it is abutting the Elm Court land, so they knew each other well. And here is where Camp Mackinac is. So it went across the road and had lake frontage. And among the things that the Olmsted firm did was rebuilding a bit of town road at Mr. Cook's expense, where he had land on two sides. So now, the point of this property was a country house for Mr. Cook, but also for his beloved daughter, Georgie de Heredia, who is here about to present some tennis trophies. And it was her lifetime home. And she, like Mrs. Sloane, had called, here's a picture of the house just before any planting has happened. No trees yet. It's still open farmland, and they're still farming it. And so this is quite fascinating to see. I tried to re-photograph this spot now, and you can't do it because there are way too many trees. So here was the garden plan as the Olmsteds offered it in 1887 or whatever. And then in 1919, Mrs. Duradia calls back the firm to do a second job on this west garden. Another Berkshire family that just kept calling the Olmsted firm back. But now we're moving to Dalton. Are you ready? And to a family that really didn't stop calling back the Olmsted firm. And that is the Cranes. Now, unlike the de Heredias or the Sloanes, Zenas Crane grew up on the land he was improving with Olmsted. This is the Cranes of the paper-making family, and they went back long connection to Dalton. So what he had was a family property where he built a new house and wanted the ponds and the stream and the plantings to be thought through by the Olmsted firm. And of course, they spent forever talking about where the laundry should hang or where the back driveways should go. But this property is on the Pittsfield-Dalton line. In fact, part of it's in Pittsfield, if you can visualize that. In the Olmsted archives, you can find correspondence and drawings for an incredible amount of detail. There are things that aren't there, which is sort of a shame, but I could find a little inter-office memo where the Olmsted Frederick Dawson is coming to meet Mr. Crane at the mill, walk down to the house, talk over what they're going to do, how to deal with Mrs. Crane's ideas, which aren't what Olmsted wanted. And finally, they do a very grand formal garden for Mrs. Crane. And if you can't see it, stand up and take a look, because it's so beautiful. It is a work of art, but it is not the idea of Frederick Law Olmsted. It's how do you satisfy the client, right? But after the Zenas Crane era, this property remained in the Crane family, and it has, over the years, reverted to its natural state. And so Allison Crane, right here, showed me around a couple of days ago, and it is reverted to what Olmsted would have wanted. The incredible, just natural beauty. Yeah. And I feel that if you think about what it's like to drive through Coltsville with concrete everywhere, stoplights that last way too long, you are inches from this calm landscape right next to all the things that Olmsted was trying to mitigate. So it's a very, very special landscape. Now, last one. Ready for the last one? We're going to South County. And here is a small-scale little treasure overlooking a picturesque lake. And it was built for Curtis Judd, who grew up in Lee and made a fortune in the Keeley cure. Does anyone know what the Keeley cure was? Oh, he made a fortune in alcoholism. And the Keeley Institutes all over the country were early efforts that have been laughed at for being a sort of a joke, but also followed with principles of a group together figuring out how people can solve alcoholic problems. And so that's Mr. Keeley. It wasn't Keeley, but his business manager, Curtis Judd, came back to the Berkshires, bought a beautiful piece of farmland on a ridge, and it went down to the lake. Has a fabulous curved driveway as you enter, and these little steps down to the lake. And here, it's too hard for you to see, but I threw this in. A bit of correspondence from Mrs. Judd on Rock Ridge Stationery. Hillary looking carefully. Here she is complaining that the plants that were planted in the fall are all dying, except for the laurel that was already there. So anyway, there's always those sides to landscape architectures. And so in this lovely place, Hillary Dealey spent many, many years as her family owned it. So I hand it over to Phil and Hillary.
Thank you. Thank you, Mimi. That's just great. I think it gives us a wonderful way to make particular some of the generalizations that Hugh is making about Olmsted. One of the questions that I have, and maybe it starts with Hugh, but it could go either way, is there seems to be this duality between Olmsted as the popularizer, the one who opens, parks for all and all the rest of it, and then being at the heart of the elite, the most elite of the elite, just doing the Jeff Bezos bridge work of the 19th century. And so how did he or did people perceive a kind of dichotomy there, or was this just a part of the work he did?
I think he was put his head down, just go to work kind of guy. I think he knew what he cared about. And I think he cared just as much about the Yosemites and Niagara Falls of the world as he did about the Prospect Parks and the Central Parks and the Buffalo Parks and the other ones. And I think he was running a business that had to make a certain amount of money and working for sophisticated people who had the means to do nice landscapes. I have in the correspondence that I've read, he treats everybody pretty much the same. He writes. Really was a very good writer. One of the great values of the reports that he did. If you came to him and said, "I want you to do this," he would come, he would look, he'd make some drawings, but he would write you a report, a very detailed description of what was going to be there, which is incredibly valuable today because not only for people like us who are interested in understanding the past, but people who are physically, they have their fingers in the dirt at these parks, and I'm sure Dee Dee can speak to this too. They go to the archive and they find these documents, these drawings, and they know what isn't there today because they have the description of it or they have the drawings of it that date back to when they were designed. And that's true with the fancy houses, and it's true with the big parks, and it's true of the miscellaneous small things that he did as well.
Yeah. Right. Questions from the audience? You've heard lots of different observations.
The Olmsted Junior firm was in existence for a long time after Olmsted Senior passed.
Yes.
I think I've even been by their Brookline offices.
The one paragraph version of this is Olmsted ran the practice until 95 when he began to kind of lose memory and other mental capacity, at which point his stepson and nephew, same person, he married his brother's widow. So John Olmsted, and his blood son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., a.k.a. Rick. Rick and John ran the practice until John died in 20. Rick lived on until he retired. He left the practice in 49, but I think he lived until 1958. And the practice survived into the 1980s.
It gives them a certain impressive longevity.
It does. It does indeed.
Yeah, and I left this out of the whole Crane story, because the Cranes were still bringing Olmsted firm back as late as the 1970s to do work for properties they owned and for the Dalton Public Works. And I mean, they were the longest clients that I can imagine. But have any of you been to, do you know Gravesley Terrace in Pittsfield? Which was Mrs. Crane, Cooley Crane's family property. That's designed by the Olmsted firm in the 1960s, maybe. So the continuation in the Berkshires of this connection went right on.
Right. One other thing to your point, Carl. When you are in Brookline today and you go past the Olmsted site, that's a National Park Service site, and I showed you a picture of it earlier. It's the Fairstead house that named Fairstead after an Olmsted estate in England that Olmsted had seen, that he moved into with his family in the early 1880s, and the practice was operated out of there until it closed in the 1980s. And in fact, the papers remained there until I think the last 15 or 20 years when they were all moved to the Library of Congress. And as Nini alluded to a minute ago, they're all available online. So you can go see a lot of these images online because they've all been digitized, which is a fantastic resource. It's a resource for us who are interested, but it's also a resource. And I've actually had this conversation with someone from Seattle. We have a Seattle park. We love our Seattle park. And when we were trying to figure out what we were going to do, we went and found those papers and looked at them. And you can do it online. So,
Yes.
Can you talk about how Olmsted got the commission for Central Park? I hear the competition was fierce.
Well, he already had the job as superintendent. Because he was very well connected, he knew Henry Holt, he knew Washington Irving, he knew everybody who was anybody. So when he heard that the job of superintendent was available, he applied. He had all his pals call up and say, he's really the man for the job. And he got that job. And at that point, they had only a preliminary plan that nobody thought was really very good. So Calvert Vaux primarily persuaded the commissioners of the park. The commissioners of the park had been appointed as a piece of legislation that passed in the early 1850s to establish a park in New York, and the governing body was the commissioners. So Calvert Vaux persuaded the commissioners to have a contest, and there was a competition to which there were 33 submissions. Theirs was the 33rd. The last day of the contest was, I want to say, March 31st, 1858. And they got there after 5 o'clock. And so they had to knock on the door. A janitor came to the door and took their submission, number 33, and entered it. And it was far and away better than anybody else's. For one thing, it had some Olmsted text. It had some spectacular drawings by Calvert Vaux. So they won the competition. They were then appointed. They were given various jobs and various job titles, and they executed the park over the period of the next something like 20 years. But actually, a park, just like your house, people say to you, is your house finished? It's never finished. A park is never finished. Anyway.
I see in the brochure that it mentions that Olmsted had connections designing Shadowbrook for Anselm Phelps Stokes. And could you tell us more about what occurred there, or what his connections were there?
Right. So what often happens is that there are projects that don't go anywhere, and I think that was one. You're sitting next to someone who might know, because Sarah Hatch is a descendant. But I think that was one of a number that he had an initial consult and didn't. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, Nini, this is probably for you. Of the Berkshire landscapes, how much of the original plantings have been saved or restored? It looks like just the views in many cases have been there.
So probably trees survive of the Olmsted era, and nothing that was a perennial or a shrub, or maybe some lilacs and really tough ones, but landscapes don't last 120 years. But what is interesting is that there are the landscape planting plans. I mean, for instance, Hillary's mother got the Olmsted plans for Rock Ridge, and you can see what they were recommending planting. So they're short term what survives, but you can still replant.
And may I just say, the new owners are planning to replant it exactly according to the drawing. I was hoping it would be done by this year, but I can only pressure people so much.
I think it's worth noting that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. hated flower beds. He thought flowers were awful. For one thing, he was colorblind. He had red, yellow colorblind, so he wasn't completely colorblind. He didn't only see in black and white, but flowers didn't make a lot of sense to him. Partly because he didn't see them the way some people do, but also because of the very impermanence that Nini was mentioning. If you're designing a train station that you want to last 40 years, and you plant some big trees and some big bushes, they're going to be there, and they're probably going to be fine some decades down the road. The flower beds, as soon as you lose your gardener, that's history. That's gone away. So very little of Senior's work involves flower beds. He did it when asked, if he had a customer who said, you got to do this, but he almost certainly would have handed that over to a draftsman because he could have cared less.
Yeah. We're talking as though flowers go away and trees don't. We've lost chestnut and elm to blight, so were those
Indeed.
essential to his designs?
He loved the elm tree, made his heart go pitter-patter. He loved the elm tree, used it all over the place. In fact, there's a very famous elm in front of Olmsted that lasted a very long time that only recently has been replaced.
If you read Mr. Blossom's report, which is riveting for those of us from Stockbridge, but if you read his report, he recommends taking down all the alternate species from Main Street all the way along and just replanting elm, everything elm. And for those of us who grew up in Stockbridge and remember when the elms were cut down, you can only imagine what happens as we now learn, with the kind of monoculture, that with a reliance on a particular tree, it would have had unintended consequences.
Yes.
A couple more questions. Yes.
I was intrigued by your comments about the relationship between Olmsted and Richardson, and I'm interested if you could say a little bit more about how that developed over time and whether they maintained contact and what happened to Richardson.
Yes. They met, we don't actually know exactly when they met, but they were both members of the Century Club. They both commuted from Staten Island to Manhattan every day in the 1860s. So at some point they clearly encountered one another. They did a project. Their first project was a tomb in Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. But they did a series of roughly 24 other projects, including the Insane Asylum in Buffalo, which is an existing and magnificent building. It used to be we didn't hide away people who had mental illness. It was that Buffalo built this building very proudly right next to a park, a brand new Olmsted Park. And Olmsted designed the landscape for this mental institution because they actually cured something like 3/4 of the people that came through their institution. But anyway, that's a whole other story. They did that. They did a whole series of buildings. If you're really interested in Richardson, you obviously have to start with Trinity Church in Boston, which is in Copley Square, which is his most magnificent edifice. But if you want to take, a graduate course, then you want to go to Northeastern, which is where that town hall was that I pointed to you. And there's also a library. Richardson designed a series of libraries. Olmsted landscaped most of them. So their practice, their joint operation, they weren't ever partners or anything, but their joint operation consisted of a couple of dozen jobs and really only ended when Richardson, who had kidney disease, who had Bright's disease, died at the very young age of 47. And one of the reasons that we don't know Richardson any better than we do is that he died at 47. And he left behind something like 80 built works. Unlike somebody like Frank Lloyd Wright, who was profoundly influenced by Richardson, more than any other architect, there are so many elements in Wright that you look at it and you say, oh, that arch is Richardson. Oh, that low roof, that's Richardson. Wright had essentially 3 careers because he lived to 90-something. And so you've got this 20-year period in his early Prairie days. You've got this 20-year period. Anyway, he left more than 500 built structures. So it's not that surprising that we would remember Wright and not so much Richardson. Anyway, there's much more to be said on that.
A couple more questions. If we have any. Well, I tell you what I'd like to do then to end the program is to give each of you a last word. And perhaps just as you reflect back on the bicentennial of Olmsted, and you think about the Berkshires as being a place where many projects were done, and you think about some of the ecological challenges that you referred to that we face down in the future. What's the importance, the central message, the takeaway that you'd like us to take away from this evening's program? So I'll give Nini you go first. You get a mic.
I guess the first thing I'd say about Olmsted is I wish he were alive today because he would have raised his voice very effectively as we fight climate change. And he would have found some answers. I mean, he was someone who confronted unusual and different situations that nobody else had, and he always found a good way. Now, I don't think there are any magic answers, but it sure would have been great to have him on our team right about now. I think that's true. And the other thing is, I think that what he did, particularly the city parks, need to be treasured because they make our cities better. They simply do. And it's wonderful to have seen the transformation. I moved to New York right after college, almost 50 years ago. Central Park was a mess. And the Central Park Conservancy came along, and they've done astonishing things. And it's this magnificent park that people come from around the world to see it. And they did in the 19th century, too, by the way. It was a very special thing when it was created. So I think we need to treasure his legacy and what he did.
Well, I was just sitting here thinking, I'm looking forward to hearing from Dee Dee Petri tomorrow, because she represents how the Olmsted community has grown in how many years?
40 years.
In the past 40 years, that by getting together in various ways, people that are caring for these beautiful places, which many people didn't probably realize were even designed by a landscape architect. So now we have a community of Olmsted enthusiasts as we celebrate his 200th birthday. He'd be surprised. So we'll be off to the Daniel Chester French designed landscape at Laurel Hill tomorrow.